They don't always tell you about these things. Hi, I'm Kent and welcome to Turn a Wood Bowl. Today I'm going to share 5 different things that a lot of people don't talk about. It's not that they hide them from us necessarily, they just don't think of mentioning them, especially after people have turned for a while. You kind of take these things for granted and you don't realize that people that are having a little bit of issues struggling turning or just getting started turning really need to know these various things that really aren't talked about a lot. So let's jump right in and see if any of these things help you with your turning. Okay, so let's talk about the first thing that I want to share with you guys that I don't think is being talked about enough. And I know it's not being talked about enough because I get this question asked frequently. I have a log that I just acquired. How long do I need to let it dry in order to turn it into a bowl? Well, there's kind of 2 parts to that question. Number one, there's some variables that are going to pertain to how long it would actually take for that log to dry. If it's a thick log, a big piece that's several inches thick, it could take years to dry. But the real question is underlying in there is, do you realize you do not have to let the log dry completely in order to turn? As a matter of fact, it's much better to turn wood that has a higher moisture content. But there are some drawbacks, and we'll talk about those in just a second. Now, I think the misnomer from this comes from woodworking versus wood turning. When we are doing woodworking, we're typically using lumber that has been milled for us and is nice and flat and straight and dry. And we want that when we're building a project or we're constructing something with a traditional woodworking process. We don't want that wood to be distorting and moving around and causing problems down the road. We want it to be nice and dry and stable. That makes sense. Well, I think a lot of people take that and bring it into the wood turning world and think they can only turn things that are dry on the lathe, and that's not true. Not only is it not true, it's incredibly difficult to turn something that's 100% dry and get a bowl that's as big as something like this. Bowl blanks this size, this depth, and this diameter are not available from any big box store, and there are only a handful of places around the country where you can actually go buy bowl blanks that large, and they're usually very expensive. So you're going to have to go get your own lumber, or your own wood rather, usually in log form, to make bowls this size. And when you do that, 99% of the time that wood has moisture in it, and that's not a bad thing. What you're going to want to do is you're actually going to want to turn these bowls in when they're wet, when the wood is moist. That is the best time to turn it. You're going to have a much better turning experience than trying to turn a large piece of wood that's that dry. Not to mention the fact that if you attempt to take a log that's that large and dry it completely, it's most likely going to crack dramatically and be unusable after many years of drying than just turning it wet. So what you do, there's 2 ways of going about this. You can turn the log wet and you can do the bowl shape complete at that point and just turn the bowl that you want. But you have to remember that when that wood is wet, it's going to warp and distort as it dries. So it's going to twist and turn, and it's not going to be perfectly round. Some bowls I've turned have pulled into the side so that it looks like the shape of a football, and that's an American football, the oval shape one. And a lot of times the rim will rise and fall on certain sizes, the pith will go up. So there's all sorts of things that'll happen when you turn typically a thin, once turned bowl. If you want a bowl to be like this, where it's nice and round and true, and it stays round and true, then you're going to want to twice turn that. And twice turning involves, just as you imagine, turning it twice. You turn it once while it's wet, and you leave the walls really thick, and you let the whole piece dry. Because you've shaped the rough shape of the bowl, and the walls they're thick, but they're much thinner than that big mass of wood, it's going to dry relatively fast compared to the whole log. Once it's dried, then you put it back on the lathe and you turn it again, and then you get your nice true round shape. And since all the distortion has already happened with that initial drying process, this won't distort and move like it would if I just turned it once while the log was wet. So to answer that question, you're really not going to take a large log and wait for it to dry completely before you're going to turn something with it. It can be done, but it's going to be incredibly difficult, and it's going to take many, many years to do it if it's successful at all, because again, cracks will probably play a big part of that. Now, I have a course all about how to take trees to bowls, and it's called Tree to Bowl, Understanding Green Wood. And it's on my website, turnawoodbowl.com. Go over to courses. You'll see that up at the top in the menu. Click courses and you'll see the course there. In that course, I go over everything you're going to need to know to process raw wood in order to make bowl blanks. Whether you're doing a log or two that you found in the ditch or that somebody gave you, or if you're processing an entire tree, you're really going to want to check out this course, because I've got tons of great information for exactly processing wood for bowls. All right, the next thing that people don't talk about a lot is the tool rest. And what is the best position for the tool rest? Well, the best position for the tool rest is always changing, which means you need to also be changing the position of the tool rest on a regular basis. Why is this? Well, as we're cutting a bowl or roughing out the shape, for instance, we are making passes that's removing material. And as we remove material, we increase the space between the tool rest and the bowl blank. And the farther the tool rest gets away from the bowl blank, the less control you have, and the more leverage goes to the bowl. Let's take a look at this. What you really want in an ideal tool rest position is first of all, you want the tool that you're using. Now that's really important too, because the tool that you're using is going to change, and each tool needs to be repositioned potentially. The tool rest needs to be repositioned for each tool as you turn. And let me show you what I mean. First of all, you want to make sure that the tool rest is positioned typically a little bit lower than the center of the bowl. What you're really looking for is the cutting tool, in this case a bowl gouge. You want that bowl gouge to be right on the center line, not below it, not above it. You want the cutting point of the bowl gouge to be right on that center line. And that means that the tool rest has to be a little below the center line based on the particular tool. Now, if I'm using my 1/2-inch bowl gouge, I have to bring the tool rest up a little bit higher than I do for my 5/8-inch bowl gouge, because it's a little bit wider. So I have to make those little micro adjustments frequently for height. The position of the tool rest in relationship of where I'm cutting on the bowl, it really needs to be as close as I can get and still have good tool support. Now, I don't want the tool rest rubbing the bowl. That wouldn't give me good tool support. I need to make sure that the bottom shaft of the bowl gouge has good support on the tool rest, and I don't want it so close that the bevel is potentially touching, because that's going to change the way the bowl gouge is positioned as well. So I don't want it too close, but I also don't want it too far away. If I get too far away, then we start having a leverage issue. If you think about what we're doing, by having the tool rest up really close, there's only a little bit of that bowl gouge that's sticking beyond the tool rest. Behind the tool rest, I have this great big lever, which is the shaft of the bowl gouge and the handle of the bowl gouge. That lever gives me a lot of control. Because there's only a little bit that's extending beyond that tool rest, I can position this lever essentially, or the handle, I can position it very easily with very little effort. Now, if that tool rest is moved back, or the fulcrum moves back, I'm starting to give up some of that advantage to the bowl itself, and you don't want that, because a little catch with the bowl gouge extending way over the tool rest can become really nasty. It could have enough force to pull the tool out of your hand. But by keeping the tool rest really close to the bowl at all times, you eliminate that problem. When you're working the inside of a bowl, you can't always get the tool rest exactly close to it. Many times a inside curved tool rest is really beneficial for those situations, so you have maximum support as close as you can to the cutting surface. just remember, you want to keep moving the tool rest. The tool rest is always going to be repositioned. Now, there are products out there that have little stops on them, like a collar that can go on the shaft of your tool rest so that it's automatically set to a certain height. When I'm turning a bowl and I'm using my bowl gouge, I'm not adjusting the height too much. I will adjust it a little bit between the 1/2 inch and the 5/8 inch bowl gouge, but I'm not changing it too much. Now, if I were changing between a lot of different tools, like if I were to use a scraper or something of that nature, many times with a scraper, like a round nose scraper, I actually want to bring the handle up so that I'm decreasing the opportunity for there to be a catch. What that means is the tool rest has to be above the center line so that when I angle the round nose bevel down into the bowl, the edge of the bevel is on the center line of the cutting point at that point. Now, I'm exaggerating these angles a little bit. It's usually just a very subtle angle, but still the tool rest has to be above that center line when I'm using that tool. So it's much better to get in the habit of constantly adjusting your tool rest, always setting the height where it needs to be and always moving the tool rest so it's giving you the closest support you can to the bowl blank. So I don't recommend using the little kind of cheating devices for the stops. So you always have a stop at a certain point. I don't use anything like that because, like I said, I'm always adjusting where that point is most optimal for each tool that I'm turning on the lathe. All right, now the next thing that people don't talk about enough is supported grain cut. Now, the supported grain cut is kind of a term that I use. I'm sure there's other people out there using that term. It's a little bit more elaborate, but a lot of times you'll hear things like turning with the grain or turning downhill or things like that. And those terms can be so confusing, especially when we're turning side grain mounted bowl blanks. And to be quite honest, this topic is much larger than what we can cover in this particular video, and I actually have a video all about supported grain cuts. I highly recommend checking this out. Essentially what happens is the wood grain direction and the way we're cutting through that grain, there are essentially, you can only go left to right or right to left, and one of those directions is going to push up fibers and pull them apart, and you're going to have a very rough surface when you cut against the supported grain direction. Now, when you cut with the supported grain direction, you're going to have a nice smooth cut, and each of those fibers are going to be cut off cleanly, and you won't see as much ripping and tearing, and you should have a relatively smooth surface. So I'm just going to tell you this: if you're turning bowls and you've got most of your techniques down and you feel pretty comfortable turning, but for some reason your bowls have a really rough surface on them, it might be the fact that you are not cutting in a supported grain cut direction. Now, check out that video again. There's going to be all the details you need for that there. And I think you're going to be surprised that once you understand what a supported grain cut is, you're going to be so much happier turning, and you're going to avoid a lot of headaches with rough surfaces and excessive sanding. There's no reason to have to sand for a super long time to make a smooth surface. Instead, you want to make your cuts nice and smooth with a supported grain cut. The next thing that a lot of people don't talk about is the size or the length of a tenon that goes into a 4-jaw chuck. Now, why do I say that a lot of people don't talk about this? Well, because I get a lot of people asking questions similar to the log and how long does it take to dry the log before I turn it. I get a lot of people asking questions about why they need to turn a shoulder on their tenon and why they need to make it a certain length and why they can't let it touch the bottom. Well, the one thing you don't want to do when you're cutting a tenon to go inside a 4-jaw chuck is you do not want the tenon to be so long that it bottoms out in the bottom of the chuck. The bottom of the chuck is not the precision point of the 4-jaw chuck. The precision point of the 4-jaw chuck, believe it or not, is the flat top surface of the jaws and the inside or the outside of the jaws, depending on if you're making a tenon or if you're making a recessed mortise. Those are the 2 points of the chuck that you want to be contacting, and that's it. You do not want your bowl blank, or the tenon rather, touching the bottom of the chuck, because you're just not going to have a precise, tight connection. And your bowl blank will move, whether it's a very subtle movement or violent, or potentially come loose and come out of your chuck altogether. So what you want is you want your tenon to be approximately 2/3 of the depth of the inside of your 4-jaw chuck. And that's it. You do not want it to be deeper than that. Inside here you have the connecting screws and that. This is not precise in here. If you're touching in there, you're not getting a true connection that's not going to vibrate. Instead, what you want is you want the tenon to be locked on the inside of the jaws, and you want that shoulder to be seated flat up against the top of those jaws. That is the precision connection point of a 4-jaw chuck. Now, why make a shoulder? Well, the shoulder is almost more important than the tenon if you think about it. The tenon sits down inside here. The jaws come in and grip it, okay? As we're turning the bowl, we're applying a lot of side force on the side of this connection. And if there's no shoulder there, it wouldn't be much for us to get a catch and have the bowl get pushed to one side or another inside the jaws. And when that happens, then it's going to be wobbling. And if it wobbles enough, it'll vibrate itself right out of the chuck. But instead, because we have a nice flat shoulder that is seated right up against the top of these jaws, it doesn't have the lateral movement to wiggle around. So even if we get a catch while we're turning, we shouldn't be creating enough force that's going to dislodge this. It might move out just a little bit. If that's the case, then all you have to do is loosen this, seat it back in properly, and tighten it back up. But if there's no shoulder there, it's going to move around and you're going to have all sorts of inaccurate connections, and it's just not a good experience. And you're going to see a lot of vibration. What's really frustrating is you might be turning the bowl for a while and it looks perfectly true and round and turning clean, and then all of a sudden it gets a little bump, and all of a sudden you're seeing this wobble now. So now it's not turning true and you don't know why. Well, it's because it's the location of where it's seated in the jaws has changed. So that's why it's really important to have a tenon that's about 2/3 of the depth of the chuck, and you want to have that nice flat true shoulder, so it's making a really good connection there, both to support the tenon and to prevent lateral movement in the bowl blank. All right, here's one that I know doesn't get talked about a lot. I had to think about this one a lot myself because there were some things that were happening, different issues I've had in the past on the surface of bowls, and I really had to stop and question what is happening. And a lot of them came back to the pace or the cutting pace of the bowl gouge. And this is pretty interesting if you think about it. There's two directions that this can go and be problematic. Number one is if your pace is too fast. If your pace is too fast, or side note, if the lathe speed is too slow, you could potentially have these concentric circles that go around your bowl, and they're going to look like grooves, and it's going to be kind of like a record player if you think about it. And what's happening in this situation, the bowl gouge is not being allowed enough time to cut all the way around the bowl and make a clean pass. Instead, there's a cut that's being started on one side, and before the bowl gets all the way around, the gouge has already moved past the cutting point. So when this happens, you're going to see these ridges or grooves on your bowl. If you're seeing the ridges or grooves, then your cutting pace is too fast or your lathe is too slow. So what do? You do one of two things. You slow your cutting pace down. So slow your body movement down as you're moving across the tool rest, and let your tool have plenty of time to make a nice clean cut. If the lathe is turning too slow, now keep in mind, you don't want to turn bowl blanks at excessive amounts of speed, especially nowhere near the speed of which you would turn a spindle on the lathe. Bowl blanks turn much slower than spindles, and there are all sorts of reasons, and I've got a video all about that, and you're going to want to check that out. But essentially, the bowl is going to be turned at slower speeds. If you've maxed out the speed and you're turning the bowl as fast as you safely can, then you're going to want to slow down your pace so you're not getting these grooves in your bowl. If you're lathe is going slower, then you can speed it up and potentially make the cutting pass about the same speed, or you may still have to slow it down. Either way, you want to slow down and make sure you want to slow down your pace, speed up the lathe so that you're making a nice clean cut and you're allowing the tool to cut each of the passes before it gets around. Now, the other problem that could happen as well is if you're turning really slow and you're wandering with the bowl gouge. You could turn too slow and actually get a nice smooth surface, but there's also some sacrifice in that. It's hard to maintain a clean, even curve if you're going too slow. So you may need to speed up if that's the case. Also, another factor, if you're turning slow like this, you're probably going to see some waviness, not the little ridges like you're seeing if you're cutting too fast, but just kind of a waviness as if the shape of the bowl is just kind of wandering versus having a nice flowing curve. Another thing that's really important when you're turning the outside, especially the outside of the bowl, is to be looking at the top edge of the bowl. Don't be looking down at your tool. You're going to look down at your tool when you get it set up on the tool rest and you start the cut. That's fine. But as you're making the cut and you're making your body motion and turning and going around the curve of the bowl, watch the top edge of the bowl, and that's going to give you a clearer idea of what the shape of the bowl is going to be. And you're going to see if the bowl gouge starts waving and doing things like this, and it'll be much easier by looking up there to redirect it and correct it into the proper path. Think of it as riding your bicycle. When you put the bowl gouge on the tool rest, it's kind of when you step on your bicycle and you get your feet positioned in your pedals. You may have to look down at your pedals and make sure everything's set up right. But once your feet are on the pedals, you're not looking at them anymore. You're looking at the road in front of you. And just like that bicycle, when you're looking on the road in front of you, you're going to have a nice clean path. If you're looking at your feet while you're riding the bicycle, there's a good chance the bicycle is going to wander down the road, and it's not the ideal way to be riding a bicycle. Well, it's the same thing with turning bowls. You don't want to be watching the tool or the cutting point all the time. You can glance at it sometimes, but watch that shape you're turning by looking at the top edge, and you're going to see your bowls are going to start becoming a lot smoother and your curves are going to be a lot more fluid in the future. So there you have it. There are 5 things that typically aren't discussed very often, and they're relatively important. If you found anything in this video that you didn't know or that you've learned, any little aha moments, do me a favor and leave me a comment below and let me know what you picked up from this video. Let me know if any of these things were kind of mysteries or unspoken things that you'd never heard about prior to this video. I think it's super important that we share this information so that we're all on a much leveler playing field as far as being able to create the bowls that we imagine that we can make. And that's why I make this channel. It's why I do my website, Turn a Wood Bowl. So if you wouldn't mind, do me a huge favor, click that like button if you've liked this video and subscribe. Also, check out my website, turnawoodbowl.com. And as you might imagine, I have tons of information there all about turning wood bowls. All right, guys, thank you so much for watching this video. And as always, happy turning.